Good evening, everyone. I'm just so humbled to share the stage with everybody before me. And I feel like Paul's offered us all of the solutions already. I might bring us down a little bit. My name is Aziz. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer, and I'm based in Vancouver, which is the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I just want to start by acknowledging the tension in the work that I do in an immigration system that is founded in colonialism on this land, and what it means to welcome newcomers to colonized land. Some who are themselves fleeing the impacts of colonization in their own lands, and just what that means, the responsibility and I guess that tension that is alive for me in the work that I do. The work of the Migrant Workers Centre is focused on supporting migrant workers in Canada who have been or are being abused or exploited. And with tonight's theme of advancing work, it's impossible not to talk about the thousands of migrant workers upon which Canada and Canadians rely on, including in our agriculture, in our retail and hospitality, in construction, in healthcare, and of course in caring for our children and our elderly. Many Canadian employers rely heavily on migrant workers to fill predominantly low-wage jobs, often in sectors with poor working conditions, and just, as an example, crowded housing, hard physical labor. And the pandemic, I think, demonstrated that a lot of the essential workers that we depend on are migrant workers. It also showed us that a lot of these essential workers don't enjoy essential rights. The structure of Canada's temporary foreign worker program itself renders migrant workers prone to abuse and discrimination. And before I talk a little bit more about these conditions, I just want to recognize the many drivers of migration to Canada, including the global economic inequality between Canada and the global South, from which many migrant workers are coming, separating from their families in order to find a better life here in Canada or work, much like my parents did. And I note the paradox in considering Canada's foreign policy and our extractive industries that often contribute to this economic inequality and displacement of people from their homes. Canada has one of the highest rates of migration intensity in the world, and most recently this migration has shifted radically with an emphasis on temporary migration over permanence. Over the last 20 years, there has been a consistent shift away from permanent migration in favor of keeping migrant labor temporary in Canada. And this, I would argue, has had a profound impact on migrant workers' rights. Some workers who've been coming to Canada year after year for decades, working in our food supply chain with no pathway to permanence in this country. Migrant workers have always been at a very significant power imbalance in relation to their employers. Unlike permanent residents and Canadian citizens, migrant workers are tied to their employers and cannot circulate freely in the labor market. Most migrant workers arrive in Canada with a work permit authorizing them to work for one employer, in one location, and in one type of occupation. And as a result, it leaves them very vulnerable and dependent on their employers for their jobs and their ability to remain in Canada. These conditions, of course, make it very difficult for migrant workers to access their rights and negotiate their working conditions, or to make a complaint against their employer, or to even leave an abusive employment situation. Without labor mobility, migrant workers are unable to access whatever labor rights they have on paper. It doesn't matter. From the beginning of the pandemic, migrant agricultural workers were more prone to contracting and dying of COVID-19, with more than 15 agricultural workers whose deaths have been confirmed since the start of the pandemic. Care workers saw their liberties reduced during the lockdowns, with employers barring workers from leaving the home of their employers under the guise of health and safety. And the threat of job loss and deportation from Canada makes migrant workers uniquely vulnerable to control and exploitation, and less likely to come forward to report abuse. At the organization where I work, the Migrant Workers Centre, we often see workers in very precarious and dangerous situations with very difficult immigration circumstances. For example, Adriana, a worker from Guatemala who was recruited to work on a farm in British Columbia, made to work 16 hours a day without overtime pay, with few breaks, while being sworn at by her supervisors, physically assaulted, repeatedly called and referred to as an animal. Adriana had money stolen from her bank account by her employer, who fired her shortly after she became pregnant. Walrus, a farm worker from Jamaica who was injured on the job and threatened with repatriation back to his country because of his injury and need to recover before returning to work. A study the Migrant Workers Center conducted earlier this year examined the cases of 30 migrant workers across mainly three different industries: home care, farm work, and restaurant workers, and found that actually over 96% of migrant workers face some form of financial abuse, including in the form of unpaid wages, excessive work time, being forced to repay a portion of their wages to their employer, or having paid a recruitment fee, despite legislation across the country making that illegal. 70% of the workers also experience some kind of psychological abuse by their employer, including threats of deportation and racism. 30% of the workers reported having experienced physical abuse, and disturbingly 10% of the workers reported sexual abuse by their employer. We can and we must do better to protect all workers in Canada, including migrant workers and workers who don't have any documentation in Canada. As a country, we can and we should end work permits that tie migrant workers to an employer and ensure workers have access to permanent residence on arrival. Permanent residence, permanent status in this country is the one action that will reduce risk of exploitation and put migrant workers on a level playing field with other workers in Canada, lifting the floor of labor protections for everyone. Workers without status in Canada, refugee claimants who have come to Canada seeking protection, many of whom have put themselves at immense risk of COVID-19, of contracting COVID-19 on behalf of Canadians and others over the last 3 years, must be regularized and given permanent status in this country. And I would end just by saying that we have a moral obligation to these workers and other migrants in Canada, many of whom have worked for years in low-wage and dangerous jobs that are undesirable to Canadians, without an opportunity to ever become a permanent resident in this country. As a country with a long history of racialized and racist labor exploitation, we have an opportunity to do better and challenge the status quo, and to redefine who we welcome here and who we welcome to stay here permanently. To reimagine a fair and inclusive immigration system, one that recognizes the contributions of all migrants in this country, and one that upholds the rights and dignity of all migrants, including migrant workers. Thank you.